if you're going to say working tested product, you've got to really kind of explore what does that actually mean in a non-software context, right? What we're looking for is something that meets the definition of done. So what is it, right? It's something that we produce that can be confirmed or tested, right? Pretty simple. So you look at it, right? So the backlog item has an acceptance criteria, right? I am some sort of system actor that wants the product to exhibit some sort of behavior so that I get some sort of validation out of it, or I get some sort of value out of it. And so the implication of a backlog is that it has some sort of acceptance criteria here. And then at the end of the sprint, at the end of the period of performance, that we can validate that behavior and make sure that the user story or the backlog item meets the acceptance criteria that we set out to build. So why is that so important? The problem is, and this is what we'll talk about, is if we don't get to a clean definition of done and we can't say that it's potentially shippable, then what starts to happen is that we have an indeterminate, invisible backlog of work that is piling up behind the delivery of the user stories. So let's say, for example, I have, 1,000 points in my backlog, and let's say the team can deliver with a velocity of 200 points per sprint. Then the assumption that I want to make is that it's going to take me 5 sprints, right, to do the work. And if for some reason I only have 4 sprints, right, I know that I can get only 800 points of that backlog out. And so if we don't get to a clean definition of done, well, then what starts to happen is that all of this rework, all of the defect remediation, right, all of the architectural stuff that's unfinished, right, it either one of two things happen. It's an indeterminate amount of work, right? Or let's say we say, okay, well, fine, it's a defect, we'll just put it in the backlog, right, and estimate the indeterminate work as a user story to make it determinate. But then we actually experience this in the early days too. Well, the backlog isn't 1,000 points. It's like for every 200 points we deliver, we're putting another 150 back in the queue, right? So for all practical purposes, that our velocity is 50 or something like that, right? And so the apparent rate is a lot slower. So you just have to end up being very real about this kind of stuff, right? But the idea is that if I can get, the well-articulated backlog, I can get a well-articulated velocity, then I get to a really clean definition of done, and I get a nice linear kind of burn down chart, right? That shows me when I'm going to go to 0, and I'm not getting these kind of funny patterns in the burn down where I'm going like this, right? I mean, that can happen, right? I mean, but at the end of the day, we're not going to get as far through the backlog as we hoped we would. And so regardless of how we think about it, right, the why is that I want to avoid this 90% done, 90% left to go thing. And so clean acceptance criteria, clean testability, clean definition of done, stable velocity against a stable backlog, and then not building up indeterminate work is what's going to enable us to get to predictability. Get to adaptability later, but we're looking for predictability first. Anything that gets in the way of predictability, right? If we hide this information and we don't make it super transparent, let's say this behavior is even happening, right? Well, we at some point ask ourselves why, right? And then, a lot of times it's technical debt, right? Or it's not good acceptance criteria, right? Tons of different reasons we could be getting this behavior, but it's not the behavior we want. So we don't want to like artificially make the burn down linear. We want it to be genuinely done, genuinely potentially shippable. And again, that's why we say potentially shippable, because that's like the ultimate thing, right? The ability to take this and put it in front of a client and be able to say, yeah, it's done. Sometimes what I would try to do to get that point across back in the day would be to say something like, I want it to be so done that that the product owner can go sit down with their customer and be proud to show it to them. Right? That's what I mean by done. Right? Because left to their own devices, sometimes developers will put done all over the place, right? So, so what, right? Why? How? Right? So, That's really, so you start to think about a couple of things, right? You can take how from a couple of different angles. So how from a mechanical perspective, right? And if we think about the framework of Scrum, we have the idea of sprint planning, right? We have our daily stand-up meeting, we have our sprint review, we have our retro, right? That kind of stuff. And so, coming into the sprint planning meeting, the product owner team, has the backlog. The team sits down based upon past velocity, kind of figures out what they can do through the course of the sprint. So that stuff gets pulled in. We're having our daily stand-up meetings, right? We want to see nice linear burn down of backlog throughout the course of the sprint. Constantly validating. If we have a separation between developers and testers, we want like a tight dev test loop, right? That kind of a thing. Sometimes we might put, unit testing or some sort of automation as part of the definition of done. But regardless of how we're testing and validating, we want to make sure that we're doing that. Like I might actually be pulling in the product owner through the life of the sprint and kind of pre-validating user stories and making sure they are actually done to the product owner's satisfaction before we exit the sprint. But then the formal ceremony is that during the review, we're going to do a demo, user story by user story. The product owner is hopefully going to sign off if we've done all this stuff right. And then we're going to claim our velocity. And again, potentially shippable. The idea is that I should be able to put it in front of a client or an end user or the system actor or whatever it is, right, that we're saying is the user of the user story, and it should work, right? That's the idea. And so a lot of times we get in situations where that doesn't happen, and to whatever extent that doesn't happen, we are going to have a less than ideal situation that we're going to have to mitigate with some other compensating control. So who, right? Well, I think we talked about some of the players, right? The PO or the PO team is going to bring the user stories to the Scrum team, right? And then the PO is going to validate it on the backside. From a transformation perspective, and this is what's kind of interesting, defining who that is something that's part of a very explicit system. Something I get that might be kind of a smell around here sometimes is that we leave it up to the organization we're working with to define who these people are and the names and boxes to really decide who is authoritative. If it's a business analyst versus, somebody who's like a product manager, or it's a partnership of a bunch of people, right? I mean, that has to be really thoughtfully considered.